Dear friends, many of you must have seen the famous Broadway show called Fiddler on the Roof. In that play, the main character, Tevai, tells his wife, Golda, that their daughter, Hodel, is in love with a young man, Perchik, who was a political revolutionary. Golda protests because Perchik has nothing to take care of their daughter. But Tevai says, it is a new world now, and people marry for love, not following their tradition of the marriages being arranged by a matchmaker. Tevai then turns to his wife, Golda, and asks if she loves him, and she doesn't know how to respond. When Tevai asked her a second time, she said, "For 25 years I have lived with you, fought with you, starved with you, cooked for you, and slept with you. If that is not love, what is?" In this play, Golda gives all the examples of her love for her husband displayed in her daily life. This dialogue brings us to the message of today's readings. In the Gospel, a scribe comes to Jesus and asks him a question that pertains to the theme of love, but from a different angle or direction. He wants to know what is the first and most important commandment of all, meaning what actions must be performed for one's love to be shown toward God. Jesus then advises him to love God with his entire being, that is, love God with all his heart, with all his soul, with all his mind, and with his strength. Then Jesus adds that loving one's neighbor as himself is the next part of that commandment. Now one might ask, how could Jesus command us to love someone? As we all know, one cannot be ordered to love somebody else. One cannot be ordered to feel warmly toward another person. But one could possibly be mandated to show kindness, compassion to others. In other words, a concrete way of expressing our love for God is by extending that love to others. In this way, love of God and love of our neighbor go hand in hand. They are just like two sides of the same coin that cannot be separated. Saint John, the apostle and evangelist, underscores this point in his first letter. He writes, "For whoever does not love a brother whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen." Thus, many spiritual writers say that loving God and loving our neighbor is so closely linked that if we ignore our brother or sister, we will soon ignore God as well. And this starts with our own family. When we stop reaching out in love to our own family, soon we fail to reach out to others in love. Today's readings invite us to ask one of the most personal questions of all that we can ever ask ourselves. How loving are we toward our own family members? And if we are not very loving in our approach to our neighbor, probably we are not very loving in our approach to God either. A few years ago, the Dallas Morning News carried a letter from a young woman, and it was prompted by the death of her mom. And she wrote a very personal letter to this daily. She said, "Mom lived nearby. It would have been easy for me to drop in and have a cup of coffee and a hug. When I called Mom on the phone, our time was brief and hurried. Now I feel ashamed when I think of the times I cut her short, saying, 'Sorry, I have to run.' The world is filled with daughters like me. I hope many of them will see this and profit from it." Yes, dear friends, I'm sure many of us can relate to that woman's remarks in her letter. We too may have treated our parents, our children, and other people who need our love and affection in a similar way. And so, today's gospel is an invitation for us to take an inventory of our lives and ask ourselves if perhaps we are like that young woman. And if we are, then Jesus is offering us a challenge that we must do something about it. I like to close with a quote, an inscription that I saw at the Rockefeller Center in New York City. And this seems to be very meaningful for our times. It said, "Man's ultimate destiny depends not on whether he can learn new lessons or make new discoveries or conquests, but on his acceptance of the lesson taught about 2,000 years ago. And this lesson is to love God with our whole being and to love our neighbor as ourselves."